Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. You walk beneath the midday sun in what was once the heart of the Roman world. The forum, tourists chatter, cameras click, pigeons land uninvited on broken marble. But if you follow the ruins down a little farther, past the Temple of Saturn and the Arch of Septimius Severus, you arrive at a low structure made of thick red brick and tufa, the Curia Julia. It looks unremarkable. It doesn't rise like the Colosseum, nor carry the elegant columns of a basilica. It is boxy, angular, plain. But beneath this building, buried under layers of stone, ash, and time, lies something stranger than most realize: the literal foundations of Roman politics, both architecturally and symbolically. These are the stones that heard every lie, and they're still there. The room where it happened, the Curia Julia, was the official meeting place of the Roman Senate from 44 BCE onward. Julius Caesar commissioned it after a fire destroyed the older Curia Hostilia, an even more ancient Senate house originally founded by King Tullus Hostilius centuries earlier. But Caesar wouldn't live to see it completed. After his assassination, on the Ides of March, construction halted for a time, resumed under Augustus, and was finally completed in 29 BCE. Even then, it was not grand. It was sturdy and very, very boring. A rectangular hall, roughly 25 meters long and 18 meters wide. No ornate frescoes, no gilded statues, just a high ceiling, rows of tiered stone seats, and a floor that doesn't quite match the rest of Rome, because that floor was a message. The opus sectum, a floor that spoke quietly. The floor of the Curia wasn't a dusty dirt layer or rough stone pavement like the rest of the forum. It was built using opus sectum, a style of decorative flooring made from large, cut pieces of colored marble in geometric patterns. It was quieter than mosaic, more serious. It didn't depict gods or battles or myths. Shapes, interlocking circles, squares, and hexagons. But each piece was imported, not local. The yellow Galo Antico came from Tunisia, the red porphyry from Egypt, the green serpentine, likely from Greece. What message does the Senate building send when its floor is made of faraway marbles? Not wealth, dominion. The senators who walked across that floor were reminded, with each step, of how far Rome reached, how many territories paid tribute, how many provinces Rome could call upon. Even the floor was political, but beneath that beautiful flooring lay another floor, one much older, and that's where things get murky. What was buried under the floor? Archaeologists studying the Curia have long suspected that the foundations beneath it still contain elements of the older Curia Hostilia, the Senate house destroyed by fire during the riots that followed Clodius Puch's death in 52 BCE. Some remnants appear to lie just under the current structure, possibly parts of a stone speaker's platform, possibly the original seating rows, or even small storage recesses once used to keep public documents. And here's the odd part: no full excavation has ever taken place beneath the floor. Why? Because the Curia Julia has never collapsed. It was turned into a church in the 7th century, later used by Christian councils. It's modified but never demolished. And so, the only way to explore what's beneath is through small subfloor windows. Limited trenching, careful imaging. But that hasn't stopped researchers from guessing, because just a few meters away, in the Comitium, the older public square that predated the forum, a very specific set of steps once led to a spot where all Roman senators had to pause before entering the Curia. These steps were ceremonial, but beneath them, a stone platform, the lapis niger, the black stone that said "Do not disturb" in 1899, deep layers of soil near the curia. Then, workers stumbled upon a dark stone pavement, unlike any other in the forum. Black basalt, carved with an archaic Latin inscription, almost unreadable. The letters seemed to predate the standardized Latin alphabet, closer to Etruscan. The words mentioned something about sacred rites, a king, and a warning to those who would desecrate the site. This was the lapis niger, the black stone. Was it a grave, a shrine, a warning? No one knows for certain. Some believe it marked the burial site of Romulus, Rome's mythical founder. Others argue it was the location of a votive altar used in royal ceremonies, centuries before the Republic even existed. But one thing is clear: it sat at the foot of the old curia, and may have extended partially beneath it, or its earlier versions. This means senators, every day, walked above a space that whispered about older power. Power beyond the Republic. Power from a time when kings ruled. It was like walking into Parliament with a crown buried beneath your feet. Was it symbolic? Was it political? Or just overlooked? The ritual of the threshold enchant Roman political life was layered with symbolic thresholds, points where one passed from public to sacred, mortal to ceremonial. The doorway of the curia was such a point. The moment a senator stepped onto that geometric marble floor, he left behind his identity as a private citizen and entered the realm of collective power. But just before he did that, just before his sandaled foot touched the colored inlays of the opus sectum, he crossed over the blackened stone of the lapis niger. And even if it wasn't visible anymore, it was felt. Even Cicero, in his many orations, referenced the idea that old shadows and ancient oaths still haunted the steps of the Senate, and a government obsessed with auspices, omens, and historical memory. This wasn't superstition. It was statecraft. You don't erase your foundations. You bury them, and then you walk over them every day, not to forget them, but to remind yourself of what still lies beneath. What was that like? Imagine being a junior senator, newly elected. You're nervous. Your toga is too white. Your sandals squeak slightly as you walk toward the curia. The sun reflects off the temple rooftops, and the forum is buzzing with vendors, priests, lawyers. As you approach the curia's doorway, you look down, not because someone told you to, but because you feel something. Not fear, not reverence, just a pause. You know that somewhere under your feet, perhaps beneath 3 layers of stone, brick, and ash, are the remnants of the king's speaking platform. The stone Romulus once touched, the place where Servius Tullius passed laws before the Republic existed. And now, you're part of that lineage. It's not glamorous, it's not dramatic, it's heavy and quiet and oddly bureaucratic. And yet, that's what history is most of. The time, not fire and war, but meetings and thresholds, not thunder, but stone beneath your feet. So, what else lay beneath the curia, Julia? What other fragments, offerings, inscriptions, or bones might still lie undisturbed? What happens when a political structure is built not on ambition, but on layers of buried memory? And more importantly, what were the senators so afraid of forgetting? There's a strange quiet inside the curia, Julia. Even today, you step inside the restored structure, you'll notice the echo. Not a sharp one, like in a cathedral. A flat echo. A dry one. As though the room is tired of listening. As though it has heard too many promises made, too many denials spoken, and too many questions deflected beneath its high wooden ceiling. The chamber has no altar, no busts of emperors, no bronze laurels or carved inscriptions, just 3 tiers of marble, steps lining the walls like stone benches, and an open floor in the center. Senators once sat there, hunched in their togas, muttering their positions and shifting in the heat, arguing policy, or privilege. But today, no one speaks in that room, not because they're afraid, but because they're not sure who used to listen. And that brings us to the real mystery, not the marble floor or the ghost of a king underfoot, but the rituals of speech themselves. The way voices were arranged, filtered, directed, and remembered inside this dull brick box. Because in Rome, how something was said mattered just as much as what was said. The echo of protocoling, like the chaotic spectacle of the Roman Forum. The Senate was not meant to be exciting. Its rules were designed to make debate boring by design. Each senator could speak, but only after asking for permission. No shouting across the room, no interruptions. Speeches could last for hours, sometimes days. Cato the Younger once filibustered a proposed piece of legislation by speaking until nightfall, because, according to Roman law, no new legislation could be passed after sundown. But why such rules? Because speech, in Roman eyes, wasn't just communication. It was ritualized authority in every inch of the Senate chamber. From the seating rows to the way the light hit the floor was designed to control who could speak and how their words were remembered. You weren't speaking to your colleagues. You were speaking to history. The chairs, stet, were never there. There are no remains of actual chairs in the Curia, because senators didn't sit on thrones or plush benches. They sat on plain wooden seats, curved, uncomfortable, and unadorned. These subsellia were arranged along the 3 stone steps, and they were not fixed to the floor. You brought your own dot. In fact, wealthier senators had staff carry their chairs into the chamber each morning, trying to arrive early to get a good spot. Why? Because placement mattered. The princeps senatus, or first man of the Senate, traditionally sat at the center of the curved back wall, facing the entrance. Beside him, former consuls, then praetors, tribunes, and quaestors. The closer you sat to the center, the more attention your voice received. Not because the acoustics favored you, but because history did. And for those seated at the edge, your voice would vanish before it hit the center. Which is why so many senators chose to stand and walk toward the center of the floor when they spoke. The very same marble floor under which older relics, platforms, and altars were buried. In other words, to speak with impact, you had to walk across memory. The lost altar of peace. Let's talk about the Era Passus Senatus, the Senate's altar of peace. This was not a public monument, like Augustus's famous Era Passus Augusta on the Campus Martis. No, this one, if it existed, was far smaller and may have been hidden within or beneath the Curia itself. We only know about it through passing references in early Christian texts, which speak of a hidden altar within the old Senate building that was later cast down and broken. What was it? Perhaps it was a small place of offering, a spot where the gods were petitioned before war declarations or peace treaties. It might have been symbolic. It might have been active. It might have been nothing more than a tradition carried over from older Etruscan rituals. But here's the strange part. The Roman Senate, despite being a secular institution, continued to offer symbolic rituals during its sessions. Omens were checked, auspices were taken, sacred chickens were consulted, and somewhere, maybe under the very marble we now walk on, offerings were once burned, and no one has found them. Ash leaves no voice. The floor that wasn't always there. We talk about the opus secto floor like it's original, but it isn't. The floor you see today was installed much later in the Diocletian period, sometime around 283 to 305 CE, after the original Curia had been damaged in the fire of 283 CE, and rebuilt by Emperor Diocletian. That means whatever floor stood before, and whatever lay beneath it, was scraped away and buried. It also means that the original Republican floor, the one from Caesar's day, is long gone. What replaced it was newer, glossier, and still very geometric, but perhaps less politically charged. It was an era when senators had far less power Rome was no longer a republic. The emperor ruled everything. And so the floor reflected that. Not a celebration of dominion, but an abstraction of order. Where once there were provincial marbles symbolizing conquest, now there were mirrored patterns symbolizing unity. The center of the Senate had become less a place for independent voice and more a space for ceremonial obedience. Still beautiful, still silent, but no longer dangerous. The column, base, that shouldn't exist, 1930, while restoring the Curia. Archaeologists uncovered something odd buried in the western wall, the partial base of a column embedded directly into the foundation. This was strange for a few reasons. First, the Curia didn't have interior columns. It was an open hall taught second. This base was far older than the building itself. Some dated to the 3rd century BCE. So what was it doing inside a wall? The most plausible explanation: it was reused material from the older Curia Hostilia, or even from an earlier structure nearby. But why include it? Why not discard it? Because Romans didn't waste stone. But more importantly, because that column base may have once supported the very rostra, the speaker's platform from which orators addressed the Roman people in the columnatice, and now was buried inside a wall. That tells you something about how Rome treated its past. It didn't erase it. It built on top of it, buried it, absorbed it, and made sure you couldn't touch it anymore. Only imagine it. The platform of no return. Have you heard of the greatest Gaii? The steps of Gaius? Probably not. These were a short, unassuming set of steps located just outside the Curia in the Comitium. Some say they were named after Gaius Gracchus, the populist reformer who was assassinated in 121 BCE for his controversial attempts to redistribute land and expand Roman citizenship. The steps became a symbol of what? Unfinished speeches. Every time a senator stood upon them, it was a reminder that even the most passionate reforms, even the most powerful voices, could be silenced. No statue of Gaius stood there, just the steps, weathered, slightly uneven. Over time, they disappeared from official maps. But stones don't vanish. They sink. And that brings us back to the central question. What was really hidden beneath the steps of the Roman Senate? Was it just old foundations, ash from burned speeches, dust from forgotten laws, or was it something else entirely, a ritualized forgetting, a way to let old ideas die beneath new ones without ever admitting they had lived? What does it mean when a political system stands directly over the bones of its past mistakes? And what does it mean that no one ever dug them up? You've walked down the long central nave of the Curia Julia, maybe in your imagination, or maybe for real. You've seen the marble floors and sat on the tiered benches in your mind, where senators once debated in robes stiffed from the heat. But now we go deeper, not into grandeur, Cada, beneath the Curia's floor. Under centuries of architectural revision and ceremonial repair lies a different kind of history, not the kind written by victors or carved into triumphal arches. This one is quiet, subsurface, dust-colored, and mostly buried not by accident, but by intention. Because in Rome, what was hidden beneath the Senate wasn't just old stone or ceremonial foundations. It was memory, carefully layered, intentionally sealed. Let's begin with what remains. Foundations that don't match the walls. Most buildings are consistent with their age. The walls match the base. The columns fit the capitals. But not here, beneath the current Senate House. Archaeologists discovered mismatched stone types, older tufa and capellaccio, blocks layered beneath later brick-faced concrete. Some of these foundations belong to earlier versions of the Senate, like the Curia Hostilia, which predates Caesar's reforms. Others date back even earlier. Some suggest possibly to Etruscan civic structures. That tells us something. The Senate was never demolished completely. It was repurposed, adapted, but its bones were left intact, like a body buried with each new generation building their home atop it. in those foundations. They're irregular, uneven. Some are cut with rough stone marks that don't match Roman tooling. Coths contain fill that includes broken amphora shards, roof tiles, and even bits of charcoal, which means not just rebuilding, but covering up. But why? The ritual of covering the past Romans weren't sentimental, but they were ritualistic. When a building burned or collapsed, it wasn't simply cleaned and rebuilt. It was ritually closed. Items from the destroyed structure, statues, tools, even burnt beams were often buried beneath the new floor, not as trash, but as offerings or warnings. There's a Latin term for this, piaculum, ritual of atonement. Kia, offered to the gods for disrupting sacred ground. And the Senate. That was the most sacred ground of civic life. When Caesar rebuilt the Curia Julia, he wasn't just creating a new chamber. He was closing the chapter on the Republic, literally bearing the space where senators once voted freely, and creating a new imperial version of history to what lies beneath. Perhaps not gold, but something more powerful. The buried rituals of democracy. Bones, not of men, but of ideas. There are no tombs beneath the Senate floor, no ossuaries or chambers for the dead, at least none officially recorded. But what you find instead is almost stranger. Uninscribed altar stones, fragments of earlier walls, and floor tiles that don't belong to this building at all. A few are Etruscan in origin, identified by their distinctive etching styles and moldings, which raises the question, what was here before Rome? The Comitium, the open-air civic plaza, adjacent to the Senate, was originally an Etruscan ceremonial space. Before the Curia was even built, this was a place for ritual kingship, augury, early forms of public consultation. The earliest stone platforms uncovered here predate the Roman Republic by centuries, and so the Curia didn't just rise from rubble. It rose from competing worldviews, a dialogue not only between senators, but between eras. The Etruscan kings, who believed in divine mandate, the Republican senators, who believed in aristocratic council, and the emperors, who believed in their own permanence. Each one built over the other. Each one silenced the last. A bronze nail in the dirt, 10, the late 19th century. Italian workers clearing ground near the Curia discovered a single bronze nail embedded in the base of a long-disappeared rostra. It was ceremonial, not functional, flat-headed, possibly decorative, but some scholars believed it marked something else. In Etruscan culture and early Roman religion, bronze nails were sometimes used to mark years, driven into temple walls as a physical calendar. Others suggest it symbolized a divine witness, recording decisions made by mortals. Why was this nail embedded so deeply? And why was it not cataloged with ceremony? Because history doesn't always preserve what matters. Often, the smallest artifacts, like a misplaced nail hint at an entire structure of belief, now rotted away. What else have we missed beneath the Curia? What voices were never heard because their markers were too dull, too metallic, too uninteresting to preserve? The Senate that died in silence after the rise of the emperors. The Roman Senate became ceremonial. It still met, still debated, still voted, but the outcomes were predetermined. Augustus made sure of that, and yet the building remained. Why? Because Rome understood the power of appearances. A Senate house, even a powerless one, looked like stability. It calmed the public. It gave the illusion of continuity, even as power moved elsewhere. So the marble benches were maintained. The floor was cleaned. Structure was preserved, not because it functioned, but because it symbolized obedience, dressed up as dialogue. And beneath it, old policies, burnt timbers, vows made in an older language. A different kind of Senate, entirely one not recorded in statues or scrolls, but in buried foundations and silent platforms. The final closure. By the 7th century CE, the Roman Senate ceased to exist. The city had changed. Christianity had risen. The old civic institutions of the Republic and Empire were no longer meaningful. And what became of the Curia? It was converted into a church, the Church of St. Hadrian, Sant'Adriano al Foro. Its marble floor was covered with mosaics. The altar was placed where consuls once debated grain prices. Candles burned where laws had been drafted. And outside, the forum lay in ruin. But the walls remained, and beneath them, still, the layers of forgotten citizen read, untranslated and unresolved. What's strange is that when the Curia was finally restored to its original form in the 1930s, the church fixtures were removed, and the structure was made to resemble its Senate, but only visually. The silence is still different, not the silence of debate, waiting to erupt into oratory, but the silence of finality. Nothing will be voted on here again. The echo is only for tourists, and so we ask, what was really buried beneath the Roman Senate? Was it a temple, a forgotten altar, a civic shrine left unrecorded? Or was it something more abstract, the memory of voices, the weight of words no longer heard, decisions no longer debated, power no longer shared? Perhaps that is what was truly sealed beneath the marble. Not a treasure, not a conspiracy, but a kind of silenced trust, the idea that public institutions could represent people before they were turned into relics. And so we end not with an answer, but with a question. When you stand inside the Curia today, whose voice are you really hearing? When we imagine the Roman Senate, we picture men in white togas debating laws and declarations, voices rising, hands gesturing, the weight of power resting on every syllable. But what if the most important person in that room wasn't allowed to speak? What if the keeper of truth was silent? Beneath every great institution, there's someone unnoticed, someone whose job isn't to shape history, but to record it, to listen, to observe, to remember. In the heart of the Curia, Julia, there once stood a man, neither senator nor citizen, who stood in the shadows, stylus in hand, not by choice, but by duty, a duty that came with no reward. He was a slave, assigned by the magister, Scrini Senatus, the chief of the Senate archives, to record everything, every insult, every betrayal, every hesitant vote. And yet, history does not remember his name, but he was always there, always listening. The archivist, without a voice, Rome, was obsessed with records. The Senate didn't just debate laws, recorded them, cataloged them, filed them. Under Augustus, the Actus Senatus, the minutes of Senate meetings became standard practice. These weren't casual summaries. They were meticulous transcriptions, stored in the tabularium, the Roman state archives. But who wrote them? Certainly not the senators. The actual work fell to notari, scribes, who were often enslaved or low-status freedmen, trained in shorthand nete, Tironiane, a complex symbol system devised by Cicero's secretary, Tiro. These men sat at the edge of the chamber, head bowed, stylus scratching wax tablets at a furious pace. They were trained not just in speed, but in silence. A misplaced whisper could cost them their life, because within those tablets were secrets, political favors, conspiracies, bribes, discussed in code, even veiled threats from one faction to another. And the man recording it all, he had no power to stop it, only to remember it. Chained to the record, we don't know his name. There were thousands like him, but let's imagine just one. Not to fictionalize, but to focus. He might have come from the eastern provinces, purchased, young because of his quick memory or clear handwriting. Perhaps a Greek speaker, fluent in both Latin and Hellenistic forms. His training would have been brutal. Memorize 100 symbols. Transcribe a speech from memory. Erase and repeat. By the time he was assigned to the Senate chamber, he was more tool than man. His ears worked like a funnel. T's hands didn't shake, but his chains remained. not literal ones, perhaps. He might have worn a tunic like any servant, but he couldn't leave, couldn't speak of what he heard, couldn't even look a senator in the eye unless summoned. His job was to record, then disappear. A wall of tablets in the tabularium. The records were kept in long, rose-wooden tablets bound with leather cords, wax inscribed with dates, votes, amendments, and names. It was the scribe's job to transcribe his notes onto these more formal records after each session. He didn't get a rest day. The wax had to be reset, the cords bound tight, the documents handed to the overseer. If he made a mistake, he could be whipped or, worse, declared a forger and executed, because in Rome, the record was sacred. The law was only real if it was written, and if it was written, it could be cited, manipulated, or erased. Many senators rose to power not by oratory alone, but by learning how to edit the record, adjust a word, rephrase a clause, delay publication of a decree, pretend a vote was unanimous when it was not. The scribe saw it all and said nothing when the silence was broken, but sometimes silence broke. One early account tells of a scribe who attempted to leak a transcript of a Senate session where a controversial treaty with Parthia had been pushed through with bribes. He tried to share the details with a rival faction. He was caught and made an example of. His hands were cut off publicly in the forum, so he could never write again. This story may be exaggerated or possibly apocryphal, but it reflects a broader truth. The Senate scribes walked a razor's edge, too visible, and there were threats, too invisible, and their humanity was forgotten. But always, they were necessary. The scribal room no one talks about beneath the Senate, housed perhaps in the lower chambers near the tabularium or adjacent to the forum's underground spaces, was a scribal chamber, a room with low ceilings, poor ventilation, and rows of wax tablets and ink pots. This is where our imagined scribe spent most of his life. The chamber was not adorned. There were no statues, no frescoes, only walls stained with the soot of oil lamps and a constant scent of beeswax and sweat. It was, in many ways, the true engine of the Republic, not where policy was born, but where it is preserved. Senators came and went, empires rose and fell, but the scribes endured, working, listening, copying, long after their own names were lost. Why he mattered, you might wonder. Why I focus on a man we can't name? Because Roman history, as we know it, was shaped by scribes like him. We cite the res gesta of Augustus, the decrees of the Senate, the speeches of Cicero and Cato, because someone sat there, recording, preserving, copying them into permanence, and those copies became scrolls, and those scrolls became citations, and those citations became history. If just one of those scribes had refused to work, just one wax tablet had been lost to our entire understanding of Roman law, rhetoric, and governance might look different. He was a slave, but he was also a guardian of memory, one who could never speak, but whose silence allowed the world to listen. And so, we end this section with a question. When history is written by the powerful, but recorded by the powerless, who truly owns the truth? The truth. The Roman Senate, for all its grandeur and prestige, was not immune to fear. And for those tasked with documenting its every utterance, the scribes, the listeners, the silent recorders, the greatest fear was not being forgotten. It was being remembered incorrectly. As you walk through the forum today, it's difficult to imagine the gravity of silence. There's too much stone now, too much dust and reconstruction, but in its prime, beneath the smooth marble of the Senate steps, the voices of Rome trembled, not only in debate, but in documentation. The records had to be perfect, and those who kept them most, often enslaved men or freedmen of low status, were caught between preserving what was, and protecting themselves from what might become. What was spoken in the Curia could get a man executed, but what was written down incorrectly, prematurely, or too truthfully could bring down entire factions. Secrets etched in waxing the earliest form. The minutes of the Senate were scratched into wax tablets, temporary, fragile mediums that were just pliable enough to edit and just permanent enough to convict. These tablets were coded with Tyronian notes, a kind of shorthand developed by Cicero's slave secretary Tyro, which allowed a practiced scribe to record up to 4,000 words an hour. The speed was necessary. Senators didn't slow down for the slaves. Speeches were fast, especially when passions flared. But here's something you might not expect. Not everything was written during the meeting. Many scribes memorized entire sessions. Wax was saved for the highlights. The rest was kept in demenda, mind-trained for perfect recall. After the meeting, the scribes returned to their cramped quarters and replayed every voice, every vote, every pause. This meant the scribe was not just a recorder. He was a living archive. One misremembered word could make the difference between an alliance and a rebellion. The invisible network by the time of Tiberius and later emperors. The position of the Senate scribe became more dangerous, not because their workload changed, but because they were now caught in a shadow war between senatorial families, the Praetorian Guard and imperial spies. Let's say you were a powerful senator. You wanted to leak information to a rival. How would you do it? You couldn't risk sending a letter. You certainly couldn't speak in public. But you could, perhaps, offer a few denarii to a Senate scribe, ask him to forget to record a certain phrase, or to add a word that made your enemy appear disloyal. It happened more than once, and it made the scribes a secret weapon. But it also made them a liability. There are scattered reports in the Historia Augusta and elsewhere of scribes being disappeared during times of political upheaval, not executed publicly, just removed. No one questioned it. After all, they were slaves. And who mourns the recorder when the speech has been given? A glimpse into the scribal quarter. Imagine the scribal wing below the curia. The ceilings were low, the lamps always flickering. There were no windows, only a shaft that opened to the street above, from which dust and voices filtered down. Tables lined the room, each with a few wax tablets, a dull knife for smoothing the wax, and a stylus worn smooth by constant pressure. The scribes were seated in shifts, not because the work was divided, but because they weren't allowed to all rest at once. Someone always had to be on alert. There were no beds. A pile of straw in the corner served as rest between meetings. In this cramped space, information passed between the scribes like whispers. Who had been bribed? Who had shouted during the vote? What had been erased? No one spoke above a hush, not because they feared each other, but because their entire existence had trained them to be quiet. The ethics of the invisible hand historians often debate the accuracy of the Acta Senatus, the official Senate records. Were they truthful? Were they complete? The short answer, sometimes. But imagine being the person who had to decide what went in and what stayed out. The scribe was supposed to be a neutral vessel, but neutrality is difficult when your life depends on your decisions. If your overseer tells you to omit a name, do you disobey? If a senator makes a mistake in speech, do you correct it in the record? If a law is passed unjustly, do you hint at that injustice in your transcription? And perhaps, most importantly, if you notice a pattern arise in violence, in corruption, in betrayal, do you document it? Or do you stay silent, stylus resting, waiting for the next decree? There is something terrifying about the idea that Rome's most important debates were filtered not just through politics, but through fear, through the hands of men who had everything to lose and nothing to gain. When memory failed, what happened when a scribe couldn't keep up? Let's say one day a scribe or imagined archivist from the foremost part of a vote tally. Perhaps he was ill, or distracted, or afraid. The senators adjourn. He returns to his chamber and writes what he remembers. But it's wrong days. Later, two rival senators argue over what was recorded. Okay? One requests an audit. Okay? The copy doesn't match what he claims to have said. The scribe is summoned. He trembles. If he confesses to error, he might be punished. If he insists on the record, he might be accusing a senator of lying. Either way, the power is not with him. The outcome is decided before he enters the room. He is told that a new version will be created, that his original was lost, that he was mistaken, and like that, history is rewritten, not by force, by paperwork. How power protected the past. The emperors learned quickly that the Senate's records could be used for control. Augustus made the Actus Senatus private available, only to those authorized to read them. Later emperors, like Domitian, reportedly edited them before storage. But the scribes still saw the original words, still copied them, and some, we believe, hid fragments, tiny notes tucked behind wax tablets, words etched lightly into the wooden edges of their styluses, names whispered into letters sent to provincial friends. Nothing big, but enough to survive centuries. Later, when fragments of alternative decrees turned up in provincial archives, scholars realized that the Senate's official record might not be the whole story. Someone had kept the footnotes, and those footnotes were written not by the victors but by their slaves. A quiet legacy. So what became of these scribes? Some were freed. Few rose to minor positions in the bureaucracy. Others disappeared into the mass of Rome's anonymous underclass. But their work lived on every law you've ever read from ancient Rome. Every senatorial debate referenced by Tacitus. Every imperial decree found in stone or scroll. It began with a slave sitting in silence, scribbling with practiced hands. A man who had no vote, no freedom, no voice, and yet he preserved the voices of empire. So now, as you drift off, one final thought to carry with you. How many truths have been lost not because they were never spoken, but because the man who heard them was never allowed to write them down. The Curia Julia, with its silent walls and cracked marble, still stands in the Roman Forum today. It has been rebuilt, renovated, reimagined, but beneath the polished restorations, something quiet lingers. Not the ghosts of senators or emperors, but the weight of things never meant to be known. The weight of a record that, by all logic, should not have survived. This story begins not with an emperor or a revolt, but with the room the Arc of M. Senatus, a place so obscure most visitors to the Forum don't even notice where it used to stand. It was not a hall of glory. It was a storage vault. Its walls were windowless. Its contents were uncelebrated. But inside were the Actus Senatus, the official records of Rome's Senate. The final version of these records, heavily reviewed and edited by imperial staff, was preserved for centuries. But once in a while, once every few decades, archaeologists and historians stumble upon something stranger. A fragment, a wax tablet, a note whose phrasing doesn't match the public. Archives, whose tone is raw, more specific, more frightened, and in the early 20th century, buried in the ruins of a villa near Ostia, one such piece surfaced. A tablet with two hands. The fragment was small, no bigger than a child's slate. The wax had long since melted away, but the stylus marks had scored the underlying wood. With careful analysis and digital tracing, the scholars revealed the unmistakable presence of Tyronian notes. Shorthand from a Senate session dated to the late 2nd century. See? But this was not the strange part. The stylus marks were from two different hands. One, clear and disciplined, consistent with a trained Senate scribe. The second, far shakier, less practiced, as if written in haste. Most astonishingly, the second hand didn't contain the Senate proceedings at all. It contained a commentary, a quiet protest, a correction. The unknown writer Possibly another scribe, Cora, reader, long afterward had written, "This is not what was said." The words were changed after the vote. It was, in effect, a footnote of dissent, a whispered accusation from someone who had no power, no name, and yet had dared to leave behind the truth anyway. Why it mattered that first glance, such a fragment might seem insignificant. Just a scratch of discontent in the margins of history. But to scholars, it offered something almost forbidden, a glimpse into how the truth unraveled inside Rome's most powerful chamber. Officially, the Acta Senatus were not published until the reign of Julius Caesar. For that, Senate decisions were cloaked in secrecy. Even after their publication began, Augustus curtailed access, declaring the records confidential unless cleared by the emperor. So who, then, were these scribes writing for? The senators didn't need transcripts. They were present. The public couldn't read them, and yet the scribes wrote, copied, preserved, not for applause, not for credit, but for posterity, and perhaps for themselves. Anonymity and resistance. You were a Senate scribe in imperial Rome. You lived in paradox. You were everywhere and nowhere. You heard more than any general, remembered more than any noble, and yet your name was unrecorded. Identity, disposable. Some scribes, especially under emperors like Domitian or Commodus, served not just the Senate, but the imperial spy networks. They reported deviations in loyalty. A senator who flinched. A murmured aside during a vote. These were sometimes relayed back to palace informants without the speaker's knowledge. And yet, despite their danger, some scribes resisted, not by rising up, not with weapons, but with ink and wax, a line omitted, a name reversed, a symbol carved lightly into the wax to mark a moment of dishonesty or fear. The margins became their only voice, the corners of the tablet, their protest. Some believe that the wax tablet found near Ostio, the strange, double-handed record, was hidden intentionally. The villa where it was discovered belonged to a minor administrator. Perhaps he had been a freed scribe, granted retirement, far from the Senate's shadow. Perhaps he could not forget what he'd seen, what he had been forced to write, and so he kept a piece of it, not for vengeance, just so it wouldn't vanish, buried. Under bureaucracy, the final centuries of the Roman Empire, the Senate lost much of its power. Emperors ruled with increasing autocracy, and the Senate became more ceremonial than influential. Yet, the scribes continued their work. Why? Because history needed continuity. Even if no one read the records, they had to exist. Even if the votes were rigged, they had to be counted. Even if the speeches were lies, someone had to write them down. The scribes became, in a strange way, the keepers of Rome's illusion of republic that still functioned, even in name only. They did not protest. They did not correct. But some, it seems, still remembered what truth had looked like. The last scribe, there is no record of the last Senate scribe. No plaque, no final transcription, but we can imagine him. Perhaps it was the early 5th century. The form was quieter, the marble chipped, quipped, the great processions, fewer and dimmer. One day, perhaps, he entered the curia alone, carrying his wax and ink, only to find the chamber empty. The senators had fled the city in fear of Visigothic raids. The session was canceled. The Senate's heart had stopped beating, so he said, and for the last time, he sharpened his stylus, not to record a vote, but to inscribe one final note. Maybe it read, "No one came today, but I waited." And with that, the voice of the Senate's quietest historian faded. How many records were lost? The vast majority of Roman senatorial records are gone, burned, buried, prodded, but the institution's influence persists, its model of deliberation, its obsession with legality, its reliance on unseen workers to preserve a facade of order. If you've ever sat in a courtroom, attended a council meeting, or read the minutes of a corporate board, you are living in a world first maintained by anonymous scribes. Beneath the marble arches of the Curia, they shaped no policy, but they shaped our understanding of policy, and in doing so, they quietly influence everything that came next. So, as you close your eyes and imagine the dim corridors of the Roman Senate, the rustling of wax tablets and hushed footsteps, ask yourself, if a man writes history but is forbidden to sign his name, did he shape the world at all? Or did he merely hold the brush while others claimed the painting? You walk through the Forum Romanum in your mind, slow and quiet. Tourists are absent. The buzz of voices is gone. Instead, the early morning fog rolls over broken pillars and sunken stones. You are here not to admire the triumphal arches or the great temples. You're here for the things underfoot buried beneath centuries of construction, reconstruction, and myth, because history is rarely found in what stands tall. It is buried in what lies still beneath feet, beneath steps, beneath time. In the middle of this ancient square, there was once a stone so ordinary that no one would glance at it. Flat, square, worn, but what lay beneath it? That became the question. This is the story of that stone, and of why, for more than 1,000 years, nobody dared to move it. The black stone of the Comitium was the true heart of early Rome, long before the marble grandeur of the empire, long before the Curia Julia was completed by Julius Caesar. This was where Rome's real debates took place, beneath an open sky, with crowds shouting and pointing, surrounded by wooden platforms and a sacred fig tree. And here, in the center, lay a stone slab. It was known as the lapis niger, or black stone. And though its name sounds like something out of a fable, it was and still is entirely real. The stone was different from others. It was dark, polished, volcanic. Not from Rome, but likely imported from somewhere deeper within the Italian peninsula. It was set into the pavement, deliberately flush with the surrounding stones, so that even the souls of senators and magistrates would tread over it without pause. But the people of the Republic knew otherwise. Its stone was a warning. According to Roman tradition, this was the burial site of someone sacred. Some claimed it marked the tomb of Romulus, the founder of Rome, killed by the Senate in a fit of rage. Others believed it covered a shrine, or a curse, or an oracle. All agreed it was not to be disturbed, not because of law, but because of memory and fear. A law written in stone, but in a language no one could read in 1899. Archaeologists working under the old paving stones near the Curia discovered the lapis niger again. Beneath it was something even stranger, a fragment of one of the oldest Latin inscriptions ever found, etched in the archaic style of Bustrofedenware. The text snakes back and forth like an ox plowing a field. It was barely legible, not only because of erosion, but because the form of Latin it used was older than any Roman schoolchild had ever been taught. The inscription warned of death to anyone who dared disturb the area. Who wrote it? Why? And what exactly was it meant to protect? These questions remain unsolved, but the most curious part wasn't the message, was the location, because this wasn't tucked away in a temple. It was directly under the feet of Rome's highest officials. A curse, an edict, or a memorial lying right beneath the center of power. Imagine, for a moment, that the White House or Parliament had a slab in the floor and altar, unreadable, but never removed. That's what the lapis niger was to the Romans. It was the past daring the present to erase it, and the present, wisely, never tried. Layers upon layers. Rome is a city of stratigraphy. If you dig anywhere in the Forum, you'll find layer after layer of old pavements, buried temples, and abandoned foundations. It is a vertical city, not just horizontal. The ground rises over time, not by magic, but by human forgetfulness. Buildings collapse, markets shift, rubble becomes soil. Soil becomes foundation. The lapis niger was no exception. It likely began as a modest shrine in the early monarchy, perhaps the tomb of a war leader, or a stone commemorating the passage of some sacred boundary. Over time, as republican institutions grew more sophisticated and buildings pressed in on all sides, the shrine was no longer maintained, but instead of destroying it, the Romans built over it carefully, reverently, leaving it intact. They covered the past, but they didn't erase it. They stepped over it, and they passed down the warning. No, one must disturb what lies beneath. And no one did. Not during the Republic, not during the Empire, not even during the Christianization of Rome. When temples were smashed and icons defaced, the stone remained untouched. Why? Because sometimes, in the minds of even the most powerful rulers, the old fears still whisper. The stone that froze power. There's a strange paradox here. The stone, in theory, held no official power. No senator cast votes based on it. No priest invoked it. No general saluted it. But despite this, it held an unspoken veto over Rome itself. Not a legal veto, a spiritual one, it said. Remember what came before, and what will come after. Roman leaders, famously pragmatic, were also deeply superstitious. They consulted entrails before battle, read omens in thunder, and delayed military campaigns because of a bad dream. The lapis, not just silent, ancient, anonymous, fit perfectly into this worldview. No one could remember why it was dangerous, but everyone agreed it probably was, and so it remained a black mark on the Senate's doorstep. Not in the poetic sense, Qin, the literal one. When the stone was finally moved, eventually, time forgot the stone. We know this because during later centuries, records make no mention of it. It became just another odd square in the pavement. Perhaps even that was lost paved over during one of the forum's many renovations. It wasn't until excavations began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that its full significance resurfaced, and with it came unease. In fact, the archaeologists who uncovered it left much of the site intact. They did not remove the stone. They did not crack it open. They brushed it clean and reburied it in situ because, even in an era of rationalism, no one really wanted to test the curse. What lies beneath it remains unknown, but modern scans suggest a small chamber or niche carved into the rock beneath. Was it empty or simply waiting? Power's quietest monument. What makes this story strange is how little happened. The lapis niger is not the site of a battle. It is not a famous monument. It is not even properly visible to tourists, but it represents something very Roman, a memory that outlasted meaning. The Romans believed deeply in most the customs of the ancestors, but they rarely stopped to ask who those ancestors were or why the customs mattered. The lapis niger is proof, a tradition so old, even the origin was lost, but the respect for it continued. And in that silent square of stone, we glimpse something rare. Not a moment of triumph, not a story of betrayal, but a civilization hesitating, bowing not before a god. Not before a law, but before a question they couldn't answer. So, as you drift to sleep, imagine yourself walking barefoot across the ancient forum. You step lightly over smooth slabs, the evening sun warm on your shoulders. Beneath your foot, there is one stone that feels colder, just barely. A chill through the soul. You pause and wonder, what was buried there? And why did no one dare to know? By the time the lapis niger was carefully reburied during early 20th century excavations, archaeologists knew they had found something singular. Not a statue, not a monument, not even a tomb in the traditional sense, but a marker and invitation to remember, or perhaps a polite command not to disturb. Even as workers packed the soil back around the site, there lingered the unspoken possibility that something still lay beneath it, and that something, curiously, was not the black stone itself. It was the void beneath it. Roman cities, like the civilizations that built them, were made of layers, compacted and forgotten like pressed parchment. Roads on top of sewers, temples over shrines, basilicas atop cisterns, and directly below the stone that anchored centuries of public ritual was a small, carved-out cavity, just large enough for a man to curl inside. It wasn't much, just a niche in the volcanic bedrock, but it was precisely the kind of detail the ancient Romans never left to chance. Not quite a tomb, not quite a shrine. When archaeologists surveyed the base beneath the lapis niger, they expected to find a full tomb or a sacrificial pit. What they found, instead, was something far less definitive and far more unsettling. There were no bones, no urns, no tools, just a hollowed-out cavity shaped like a human form, and the crumbling traces of what might have been an offering, a bowl, a curved piece of bronze, some burnt organic material too far gone to identify. To some, this suggested a symbolic burial. To others, it whispered of something darker, perhaps an unrecorded human sacrifice from Rome's earliest, most myth-shrouded years. According to Livy and other early historians, ancient Rome had flirted with human sacrifice in its earliest wars, before it was formally outlawed. And yet, even after the ban, symbolic representations of sacrifice, such as burying effigies or small animals in foundations, persisted for centuries. This chamber, shallow and unadorned, might have once held more than memory. It might have held a living person, bound, buried, and offered not to the gods, but to the city itself. Rome demanded blood, and sometimes even the Senate gave it. The rituals no one talked about. It's easy to forget that the Roman Republic, for all its complexity, was still rooted in deeply primitive rites. Priests, known as the pontifices, conducted arcane ceremonies behind closed doors. Vestal virgins tended a fire said to embody the city spirit. Every political action, from the opening of the Senate to the declaration of war, was prefaced with augury, the reading of birds, sky, and wind. And at the heart of the forum, under the lapis niger, may have been one of Rome's oldest surviving sacred places, long abandoned but never desecrated. Inscriptions found nearby referred to a rex, a king, in the context of punishment. The phrase, roughly translated, includes the words, "Whosoever violates this place, let him be consecrated to the gods below." That's not a metaphor. In ancient Rome, to be consecrated in this way was a death sentence, a kind of religious exile in which the violator was considered already dead in the eyes of the state. If the lapis niger marked such a place, perhaps the scene of an early royal assassination or execution, then its stone was not merely sacred, it was cursed. Why the Senate stepped over it anyway for centuries? The Senate meant mere feet from the lapis niger, the Curia Julia, the main Senate building, from Julius Caesar's era onward, loomed just beside the black stone. Senators would gather there for debate, votes, ritual, and pronouncements, and they walked directly past the stone, every day, every week, for decades. What does it mean to build a seat of power next to a monument to death? Some believe this was precisely the point. The Romans, famously obsessed with fate and symbolism, may have chosen the location of the Curia deliberately. The stone was a reminder not of glory, but of humility. It told senators, before you speak of law, remember what lies below, because even Rome's highest voices were just echoes above the earth. The emperor, who almost dared, there was one record fragmentary, obscure, an emperor who considered removing the stone, likely during the Severan dynasty, when architectural restorations were rampant. and Rome was desperately trying to recapture its mythic past. A junior advisor, perhaps a newly promoted augur, reportedly argued that the forum needed modernization, that the superstitious slab should be replaced with a new monument honoring the imperial line. The idea was brought to the Senate. It was rejected. No formal record remains of the vote, but multiple inscriptions from that period hint at a protection of ancestral customs, decree likely a coded, cute reference to the lapis niger. The stone remained because even emperors feared the foundations beneath them. Rediscovery, reburial, and quiet. By the time the stone was rediscovered in the modern era, the rituals had long vanished, the memory blurred. And yet, something strange occurred during excavation. Local workers, mostly Roman laborers and craftsmen, began refusing to walk across the exposed stone, not because they were told not to, not because of signs, but because of something they called Malocchio, the evil eye. Some claimed that walking over the black stone made their stomachs turn, that tools snapped more easily, that the sunlight dimmed near the trenched dots of superstition. Yes, but superstition that echoes a very Roman kind of silence, the silence of things too old to explain, but to present, to deny. The stone's legacy. Today, you visit the Roman Forum now. You can see the lapis niger. It is partially cordoned off beneath a small protective roof, surrounded by broken columns and scattered masonry. Most tourists miss it. There is no great sign, no dramatic explanation, just a marker. But if you pause long enough, you'll notice something. The air around the site is still, not dead, just still. And you might realize in that moment that Rome's greatest monuments are not the arches or the palaces, but the spaces that were left alone, the ground that wasn't built over, the stones that weren't removed. Because sometimes what is preserved tells us less about what was important and more about what was feared. So as you imagine this narrow space, just a few steps wide, sunken into the stones of the forum, consider what it must have felt like to be the one tasked with maintaining it, not worshiping, not repairing, just sweeping around it, leaving it untouched. Would you have moved the stone? Would you have looked beneath it? Or would you have stepped lightly, like they all did? By the time the Roman Republic gasped its final breaths beneath the sandals of Caesar and his successors, the lapis niger had already stood witness to centuries of anxious footsteps, did not rise in protest, nor collapse in grief. It remained where it always had sunk, silent, stubborn, perhaps forgotten by some, revered by others, but never ignored. The forum around it had transformed. The cries of open market merchants had given way to marble colonnades and imperial statues. The laughter of orators now echoed off carefully planned triumphal arches, and the ancient curve of the comitium, where citizens once gathered to hear the pronouncements of tribunes, had lost its original contour. Stone replaced dirt, order replaced chaos. But not everywhere. One stone, dark and squat, remained untouched in a world that could no longer afford to leave things alone. The lapis niger, still watching, still waiting. Caesar and the stone Julius Caesar was not a man known for reverence. Though he rose through the ranks with calculated alliances and traditional offices, Quaestor, Cato Leal, Pontifex Maximus, he had a habit of discarding what no longer served his ambition. The Senate was, to him, a formality. The old rites, a stage. But even Caesar, in the redesign of the forum and the construction of his grand new curia, avoided touching the stone. When he relocated the curia, the original Senate house near the lapis niger was dismantled. Yet records suggest that Caesar specifically ordered the sacred zone around the stone to be preserved. Why? He gave no reason. Some say his mother, Aurelia Cotta, a deeply religious matron of old Roman stock, had impressed upon him the dangers of violating ancestral ground. Others argued that Caesar, though dismissive of many traditions, knew better than to tempt the gods of the underworld. The D, inferior especially when found in his new vision for Rome, in a city built on omens. One stone seemed to whisper too loudly to be ignored. The stone and the blood, the Ides of March. 44 BCE, in the shadows of the theater of Pompey, not in the Forum, not near the Lapis Niger, Caesar fell under the blades of men who called themselves liberators. The Senate had no permanent home during that season of flux, and Caesar was meeting informally in a borrowed hall under a statue of his former rival. But even though the stone did not witness the murder directly, the aftermath played out at its feet, because when the Republic cracked, the Forum trembled, and for weeks after the assassination, the area around the Lapis Niger became a strange point of convergence. Plebeians came there, hoping for a sign. Priests came uninvited to perform rites that had not been practiced in a generation. One obscure account, preserved in a fragmentary inscription, mentions a man laying his dagger on the black stone, only to flee moments later in visible terror. No one knows what he saw or claimed to see. What we do know is this: while the Senate debated and armies mobilized, the old places were not silent. They hummed with a low vibration of unease. From republic to empires, Octavian took the title Augustus and draped the empire in marble robes. He also redrew the spiritual map of the city. Temples were restored. Obelisks imported from Egypt were planted like imperial stakes in the soil. Rome became a city not just of power, but of controlled symbolism. And yet, again, the Lapis Niger was left alone. Though the nearby Curia was rebuilt in Augustan splendor, Kia, the old black stone, now cracked, weathered, barely readable, was preserved in place. Augustus, master of image and illusion, must have found it useful. It tethered the Republic to the Empire without question. It reminded the Senate every time it convened. That power once flowed through other hands, kings, priests, ancestors, shadows. It was never roped off, never gilded, never inscribed anew. It was simply there. That made it more potent than any statue. A memory kept on the edge. Over the next few centuries, emperors came and went. Domitian, Trajan, Hadrian passed through the Forum, raising new arches, decreeing new rituals. Christianity eventually arrived and shifted the spiritual center of the empire toward new gods and newer temples. But still, Lapis Niger remained. By the time of Constantine, many old rites had been outlawed. Statues of Jupiter were toppled. Sacred groves were cut down. And yet, even Christian chroniclers avoided mentioning the black stone. It was as if speaking of it would give it new life. When the Senate dwindled into ceremony and spectacle, when Rome's power slipped eastward to Constantinople, the Forum became a hushed museum of empire. And still the stone sat beneath a thin crust of dirt and time, surviving invasions, earthquakes, and the indifferent march of moss and rain. No one dared remove it. No one dared replace it. It was the last memory of something that predated even Rome's memory of itself. The unearthing one Italian archaeologist uncovered the Forum in the 20th century. They expected grandeur. They found broken columns, collapsed shrines, half-years, dedications, 2 forgotten senators. But what struck them, what unsettled them, was the way in which the Lapis Niger still demanded attention. It was not large. It was not ornate. A bed was encircled by architectural choices that made it clear this place was left alone on purpose. Even the shape of the pavement stones around it, curved just slightly enough, suggests that workers had once been ordered to cut their paths around, not through, the sacred zone. And when researchers studied the archaic Latin inscription on the broken pillar beside Itan, almost unreadable scrawl, dating back to the 6th century BC, either found a word repeated again and again: sacros, sacred, cursed, set apart, all at once. A stone in a city of ghosts today. When tourists shuffle through the forum, most of them pass the lapis niger without notice. It has no dramatic sign. No reenactment actors in plastic centurion gear nearby. No audio guide voice saying, "This is the exact spot." Because it isn't a spot, it's a silence. A memory too old to fully explain. If you were to visit the forum at dusk, when the crowds thin and the birds begin to settle along the ledges of the curia, you might feel it more than see it. The air near the stone seems slightly cooler. The shadows fall differently. And for a moment, standing at the edge of the low fence that now protects the site, you might imagine what it was like before history was written down, before Rome was Rome, when a priest stood there, or a king, or a man bound in ritual his name now lost, and when the ground had not yet decided what kind of power it would allow to rise above it. The lapis niger is not a monument. It is not a mystery to be solved. It is a refusal to be erased, to be redefined, paya, to be overwritten by the propaganda of empire, akora, the dust of decay. It does not tell you what it is. It tells you only what you are not allowed to forget. And so the question remains, what was buried that day beneath the forum, and why has no one dared to uncover it again? In the dusty quiet of the Curia Julia, where echoes once rebounded off marble and bronze, the steps that led into the Roman Senate rarely drew attention. They were ordinary in appearance, stone, worn smooth by time, gently sloping downward into the shade of history. No inscription marked them, no statue guarded them. Smooth rock, a slight chill even under midday sun and silence. But for centuries, it was whispered that beneath those very steps, somewhere below the heel of the Republic and the breath of empire, there lay a dagger. A dagger not meant for war, nor for assassination, but for something stranger. Peace. It began, as many strange Roman stories do, not in the blinding sun of triumph, but in the dense fog of a bureaucratic morning, where names are recorded on parchment and erased just as easily. A name forgotten by most, but once whispered through the marble halls like an uncertain omen. Marcus Livius Flavellus, a senator, a reformer, and a man who, according to several fragments of surviving senatorial records, simply vanished in the year 123 BCE. Not assassinated, not exiled, not even officially mourned, vanished, and somewhere beneath the steps. The only clue that ever remained was a ceremonial dagger, blunt and reportedly inscribed with a phrase that no longer exists. In Latin usage, ut quiescimus, debeo tacere, that we may have peace, I must fall silent. The problem of Marcus Flavellus are no busts of Marcus Flavellus, no statues with chipped noses, coins with his face, and yet, in dusty archives, especially in the logbooks of minor Roman clerks, name appears more frequently than one might expect for a man without legacy. A proposal here, a speech there. It's always tucked into the margins, as if the scribes who copied Senate proceedings weren't quite sure if they were supposed to record him at all. He wasn't a patrician, nor a hero of the legions. Flavellus came from the Sabine countryside, where the land was dry and the grain came late. His family were minor bureaucrats, keepers of roads and tax lists. He arrived in Rome with calloused hands and a reputation for memorizing law by candlelight. His ascent into the Senate was unremarkable, but his presence there was not. He believed in something dangerously tedious, equity, not in the grand philosophical sense, but in the dry, bureaucratic trenches of land reform and rural taxation. He argued, often alone, that the Roman state had become a machine too hungry for its own citizens, that the farmlands that once fed Rome now fed only speculation and absentee landlords. He proposed, in a speech dated March 14th, 124 BCE, that the Republic instate a system of anonymous land audits, He was mocked the next month. He tried again. This time he claimed to have support from rural senators and 1 or 2 retired generals. The mocking continued. But one fragment of that speech has survived, scratched into the side of a broken cistern in what was once a Senate storeroom. If Rome is eternal, let it not be because it forgets its people faster than its enemies. No applause, no response, it's just silence. And then, in the records of the following year, a sudden note, Flavius absent. Never again was his name entered. The theory of the dagger in the 4th century CE. Cretan monk named Marcellus of Antium compiled a collection of pagan Roman legends in order to better understand the beliefs that were being outlawed in his work Codex of the False Gods and Their Follies. There's a peculiar passage tucked into an appendix titled Curse Stones, Oaths, and Treasons. It reads, "There was once a senator whose truth wounded more than any sword, so they placed his silence in stone. Beneath the steps where laws are born, they buried not a man, but his final breath, wrapped in bronze and bound with words, a name is given." But Marcellus adds something unusual. He claims that a dagger was forged, not for cutting, but for marking, that it was a ceremonial tool meant to sign a pact, not between men, but between silence and survival. Roman law was filled with rites that seem absurd today. The striking of a pig to seal contracts, the exacting posture of augurs when consulting, bird flight, the precision required to touch certain stones during oath swearing. In this world, bearing a dagger as a legal gesture was not impossible. Some historians have connected this to a vague practice, known as sacramentum mortis, an oath taken under threat of total erasure, to keep a secret not just from others, but from history itself. Could Marcus Flavius have been forced or convinced to take such an oath? And if so, what secret could possibly have demanded his removal from memory? What the steps might hide in 1879, during minor restorations near the Forum, a workman reported discovering a patch of darker stone beneath the northeast side of the curious stairs. He described it as black as ink and shaped like a slice of a shield. When authorities returned the next day, the patch was gone. In 1922, a new theory emerged in the writings of Emilio Castellani, an archaeologist known for his obsession with underground Rome. In a paper titled Echoes in Marble, suggested that there was a hidden subchamber beneath the Senate building, void that had never collapsed nor filled in over time. He believed it was originally built as a drainage culvert, but that it had been sealed off deliberately with lead and volcanic tuff. Why? Castellani never knew. In a footnote of the same paper, he references a Roman-era inventory listing a bronze blade of no practical use stored near the Curia for ceremonial reasons. That inventory was lost in the bombings of World War II. But for decades afterward, whispers among archivists suggested it had contained references to Flavius and to an agreement. The shape of Roman silence, what happens when a state decides that forgetting is preferable to justice. Rome was a master of law, but also of forgetting. Damnatio memoria was the official condemnation of memory, used often, but unevenly. Some men had their names scratched from every inscription. Others simply vanished between lines. Flavius seems to fall into the latter camp. He wasn't dangerous because he had power. He was dangerous because he noticed patterns no one wanted to see: a republic built on land theft, on debt, peonage, on the quiet erasure of rural families in favor of port expansion and temple gold. His crime was not rebellion. It was record-keeping, so perhaps, rather than kill him, Rome made a more elegant decision. Offer him a pact. Let him live, let him disappear, and bury the oath along with its token beneath the very stones where laws would later be read aloud by men who could never pronounce his name. So the question remains: buried with the dust, did Marcus Flavius choose silence to save the Republic? Or was his silence the final proof that the Republic was already gone? The Roman Republic ran on ritual, not emotion, not even reason. Ritual, whether it was the way one adjusted the folds of a toga before addressing the Senate, the precise angle at which one touched the Statue of Victory before casting a vote, or the daily offerings left beneath the lararium in thousands of Roman homes. Life in Rome was ruled by repetition, not belief necessarily, but performance. And the more tedious the ritual, the more powerful it was believed to be, which is why if there was ever a pact to be made in silence, one that involved burying not a weapon, but a principle, Rome would not have ignored the opportunity to wrap it in ritual. And perhaps that's what happened when Marcus Livius Flavius vanished. He didn't fall. It was folded into the archives, folded into obscurity, folded into a space where records weren't destroyed. They were just never opened again. The dagger, if it existed, wasn't a murder weapon. It was a kind of legal punctuation mark. And, as strange as it might sound, Roman history gives us precedent for this kind of physical, legal symbolism. Let's slow down and walk through what such a pact might have looked like. The legal weaponry of Rome. We tend to imagine Roman law as scrolls, codices, and arguments, but Roman legal culture also included physical objects used to bind oaths. The hasta, or spear, was a symbol of property transferred stabbed into the ground to represent the taking of land. The scales used during emancipatio ceremonies where property or slaves changed hands were not for measuring, but for performance. Objects bound meaning. And the more symbolic the object, the more permanent the agreement. Which brings us to the knife. In most Roman rituals, knives were used for sacrifice, but there was a lesser-known object called the coltellus mute testa, mute blade. It appeared in certain household cults as a symbol of restrained violence, a power that chose not to act. Rare, yes, cool, but not unknown. What if Marcus Flavius was offered a chance to walk away, but only after enacting a legal ritual with such a blade? A blade symbolizing a vow that his silence would not be broken, that he would not reveal whatever it was he had uncovered about Rome's inner workings, and most importantly, that no one else in the Senate would ever speak of him again. The disappearing acts of the Republic. Rome had no shortage of disappearances. Gaius Rabirius, who was tried for the murder of a tribune decades after the act. Key, whose deaths rewrote the boundaries of Senate power. Keys, Claudius Pulcher, who vanished from history not by death but through quiet reassignment and historical neglect after military embarrassment. In most of these cases, erasure wasn't just political, it was psychological. It was about discouraging memory. What makes Flavius strange isn't that he was forgotten, it's that no one tried to remember. Even Cicero, Hove famously referenced obscure and forgotten senators in his speeches to drive home points, never mentions him. Livy's fragments gloss over that period entirely. It's as if there was an unspoken agreement. This man, and what he said, was too close to a truth Rome couldn't allow itself to hear. And in a world where ritual defined reality, burying that truth both literally and symbolically beneath the stairs of the Senate would have been a perfect act of civic hygiene. Out of sight, out of law, out of time. The archive that never existed. 1967. Historian Julia Berryman discovered a partial inventory list in the Vatican's Bibliotheca Apostolica, in a folio simply marked Fragmentus Senatus. Among tax codes and decrees regarding bridge repairs, she found a reference to a restricted chamber beneath the Curia Julia, not a crypt, not a catacomb, with something labeled as loculus consensual clausus, a compartment closed by agreement. No map, no access note, no further explanation, just a brief notation that it had been sealed in perpetuity by the triumvirate for civic order. No Roman triumvirate was ever officially known by that name, but Berryman speculated It may have referred to a temporary commission senators assigned to deal with internal matters outside of public scrutiny, much like a modern subcommittee, but without records made public. She never found the loculus, and within a year, her work was dismissed as speculative. But she also uncovered one other detail in the margin of a separate scroll. A scribe had doodled the dagger, not ornate, just a line drawing, put beside it the Latin phrase ut quiescimus, the same phrase that later Christian chroniclers claimed was inscribed on a buried blade. Was this coincidence? Oh, the faint footprint of something much stranger. Forum. As a grave of meaning, if you stand today in the Roman Forum, the Curia Julia is one of the better preserved buildings. Tourists walk its steps without noticing their wear, without considering how many laws, arguments, and whispered betrayals passed just beneath their feet. And beneath that, layers of sealed stone. Under modern regulations, excavation beneath the Senate building is not permitted due to structural fragility and historical preservation standards. But before restrictions tightened, several underground passages were explored by archaeologists in the 19th century. A few reported finding sealed vaults filled with volcanic tuff and lead bricking, precisely the materials the Romans used when they wanted something to remain closed forever. None of these vaults were fully excavated. None were dated. But the speculation remains. Could one of these be the loculus where the mute dagger rests? Not buried for its craftsmanship, not displayed for glory, just left there beneath the stones like a punctuation mark. No one was allowed to read aloud what could not be said. Aloud, Marcus Flavius might have discovered something dull, and that, ironically, would have made it even more dangerous. Perhaps it was a land census that revealed the true ownership of grain-producing estates. Perhaps he tracked the flow of taxation and discovered falsified levies. Maybe he uncovered that the Senate's laws had been influenced by a syndicate of Roman bankers consolidating ownership of debt records. These aren't dramatic revelations, but they threaten the very operating logic of the Republic. If Rome ran on corruption, then revealing it didn't just expose a scandal, it broke the illusion that the machine worked for the people. And so, a new ritual was required. Not the spectacle of damnatio memoria, where names were carved out and faces scraped off statues, but something gentler, softer, more procedural. A pact, silence, a blade without blood, the unasked question all across the ancient world. History was shaped as much by what wasn't written down as by what was. Inscriptions carved for eternity were often left incomplete when money ran out. Tomes left unmarked because the names were politically inconvenient. Letters left unanswered, their recipients lost in the fog of time. But Rome had a special talent for creating consensus by omission. If no one remembers Marcus Flavius, then perhaps he never existed. If the dagger was buried under a staircase, then it was only a stone. If a pact was signed in silence, then what is there to argue with? What remains is a lingering shape beneath the surface, a ghost, not of a man, but of a decision to let truth slide beneath the stones in exchange for stability, to protect the structure of the Republic, even if the soul had to be amputated in the process. So we ask again, was Marcus Flavius a threat to Rome? Or was he the only man who tried to protect it from itself by disappearing before it was too late? It's too late. In the old alleys of Rome, silence is heavier than stone. It gathers in corners, weighs on old bricks, and sits quietly under sun-warmed paving stones that tourists tread without knowing. Beneath the Forum, beneath the Curia Julia, beneath the red marble senators once fought to install with pomp and rage their lies, a stillness that even archaeologists rarely speak of, a stillness that may hold the quietest story of all, the story of a man who did not die for Rome, but who agreed to vanish so Rome could live. Marcus Livius Flavius, You won't find his statue in the Capitoline Museum. No bust sits on a velvet pedestal. No marble epitaph survives, if one ever existed. He was not condemned, not executed, not celebrated. There was no triumph in his name, no trial to disgrace him. He wasn't removed. He was quietly unremembered, and is here at the edge of what we know. That the final threads of this story gather, the tomb with no name in 1924. A quiet excavation took place near the Basilica Aemilia, just north of the Curia. The dig was not widely publicized. At the time, Mussolini's government was selectively highlighting Roman glory's triumphal arches, curial frescoes, and the masculine authority of Augustus and Caesar. Anything resembling bureaucratic blandness or quiet senatorial compromise was simply not photogenic enough. So, when archaeologists unearthed a subterranean chamber with a single sealed sarcophagus, no inscriptions, and no accompanying funerary goods, there was little interest from the press. What was odd, though, was the shape of the tomb. It wasn't oriented east-west like most Roman burials. It wasn't located in the outskirts where burials were traditionally placed, and it was directly aligned with the southern foundation of the Senate building. More curiously still, the sarcophagus had no name, no symbol, just a single relief etched into the side, a dagger, its point down between two scrolls, and beneath it, an inscription in deeply weathered Latin, Securitas Consenso, Silentium, Aeternum, security by agreement. Silence eternal. The dagger was not drawn. It's pointed down, buried, wedged into the space between two instruments of law. Whoever had been laid to rest here was not a soldier, not a martyr, but someone whose role had been to seal something quietly. The body inside was a man, aged roughly 50. Bones showed no signs of injury or a battle. Clothing fragments suggested a senatorial rankwool of high-quality linen wrapping, bronze belt buckle. But there were no rings, coin, no name, nothing to prove who he was. But the archaeologists believed, even then, that it was deliberate, not erased, just ... withheld. They recorded it as the tomb of an unknown statesman. The sarcophagus was never moved. It remains there, underground, in a passage not open to the public. Carving still rests beneath Rome's slow-moving feet. The logic of silence in ancient Rome. Forgetting was not always an accident. Sometimes it was a civic act. The Republic had no formal laws about forced amnesia, but it had customs. When a scandal threatened public morale, senators sometimes agreed, formally or not, to refuse recollection. Not by destroying records, but by never referencing the matter again, by declining to publish names in the fasti, the official annual record, by letting anniversaries pass unobserved, by not mentioning the disgraced at funerals, and if that person had not done anything legally wrong, if he had only learned something dangerous, then the cleanest solution was not condemnation, it was absorption. It was placing that man somewhere beneath the surface of history. It's like a stone in the foundation of a wall, necessary, invisible, and permanent. What Marcus Flavius discovered, we do not know. Perhaps he found that the voting system was rigged, that contracts for grain imports were falsified, or that foreign kings had bribed their way into Roman citizenship for strategic influence. But whatever he uncovered, it was too vast to prosecute, too real to ignore. And so, Rome did what it often did. It chose ritual over revolution. Echoes in the writings, decades later. In the letters of Pliny the Younger, there's an odd sentence buried in his commentary on the responsibilities of Roman administrators. It reads, "Some truths, when weighed too soon, have caused the scales themselves to crack." No context is given, but scholars have pointed out that the phrase follows a discussion of quiet, senatorial decisions, moments when the body chose not to. investigate a claim because the consequences were too destabilizing. One wonders, was Pliny remembering something he had been told as a boy? Or had he read a sealed record, something not meant to be copied into public scrolls? For Tacitus, the most cynically exacting of Roman historians, leaves a curious gap in his annals around the years that would have overlapped with Flavilus's career. Series of events are referenced with phrases like the matter being put to rest or the chamber declining to comment. What chamber? What matter? Why such polite indirection? Unless there had been, at some point, a decision never to name it again. The Forum at dusk, it's evening now. Imagine the Forum as the light fades. The temples stand in half shadow. Tourists begin to drift away. There's a hush that settles over the stones, not reverence, exactly, but wariness. The kind of quiet that comes when even the echoes have tired themselves out. And beneath those stones lies a man with no name and a blade, carved into his tomb, not as a symbol of violence, but as a symbol of restraint. The mute dagger, buried, not brandished, not raised in rebellion, not plunged into a back butt, folded into stone, with scrolls beside it. As if to say, law and silence are the same thing now, and the city above continues on. It always has. Governments rose and fell. Popes built over emperors. Roads shifted. Foundations cracked. No one ever moved that tomb, and no one speaks of what it may contain. What? Rome refused to know. Every city has things it cannot speak of. Events so quiet, they echo more deeply than screams. Rome is full of those moments, okay? But some, like the story of Marcus Flavius, are more than just forgotten. They are intentionally excluded, teed, not from the past, but from memory itself, because there are truths too heavy to be carried, and men too honest to survive in the open. And sometimes, it's the only peace a city can achieve is to bury the man and the idea in the same hole, then cover it with marble and bureaucracy, so as you drift tonight into sleep. You might ask, was Marcus Livius Flavius a traitor, a whistleblower, a reformer, or just a clerk who read too far into the wrong ledger? Okay, did the Senate murder him in silence? Or did they, in a rare act of unity, do something harder to let him live long enough to agree to disappear? And if so, what else have they buried that we walk over still, without knowing? You're standing in a room few ever get to see, not because it's locked or hidden, though for centuries it was, but because it's quiet, too quiet to draw attention, too quiet to be remembered. It's beneath the temple of Saturn, beneath the foundation of what once served as Rome's central treasury, the Arium Saturni, a long, cool corridor lined with niches that once held tablets, marble slabs etched with thousands of tiny Latin inscriptions, line after line of tax codes, debt records, and census tallies. And it is here, in this uncelebrated tomb of numbers, that we meet a man who left no legacy except a system. His name was Gaius Publius Ferrandus. His title, Tabularius, record keeper. Not a consul, not a general, not even a senator, but in the heart of Rome. In the 5th century after its founding, when the Republic was fragile and the wars were quiet but constant, Ferrandus was tasked with balancing what couldn't be balanced, memory. The office, no one, visited the Tabularium, a building, now mostly reduced to ruins on the Capitoline Hill, was Rome's grand archive. But deep beneath it, and spilling into adjoining vaults below the Temple of Saturn, were the quieter halls of financial records. Here, clerks recorded not just taxes and expenses, but favors, debts owed to the state, land ownership, and the peculiar records known as the red inscriptions. These were neither formal debt nor punishment, but records of silence. If a senator was quietly forgiven for misappropriating funds during a war, if a general's failed campaign was written off to preserve morale, if a tax rebellion was quelled by reducing obligations quietly instead of through force. It was Ferendis in his office that kept those records. Red ink, unindexed, hidden in plain sight. Not lies, not truths either, just the soft, boring documentation of compromise. The man at the desk is Ferendis is not recorded in any grand history of Rome. He is mentioned only once, in a surviving clay fragmenta correspondence between two local magistrates in 150 BCE. Send a remainder of the Sicilian grain list to Ferendis before the knowns. He demands precision. And I am weary of his ledgers. That's his entire public biography. But in the late 19th century, archaeologists working under the Temple of Saturn uncovered a series of tablet shards buried behind a false wall. They weren't public documents. They were working drafts, scribbled corrections, and internal annotations, and among them, dozens bore the same signature etched lightly at the bottom. GPF, the initials of a man who never asked to be known. The long year one of the surviving records is dated to a year that does not exist. A ghost year, as historians later called it, between the recorded consorships of Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Servius Fulvius Nobilior. No official Roman documents cite this year. No military campaigns are listed for it, festivals, and yet Ferendis's ledgers show full fiscal activity. Taxes collected, shipments received, senatorial stipends dispersed, a year that officially never happened. Why? Some scholars argue it was an era calendar confusion during a transitional period. Others believe it was deliberate, that a scandal large enough to paralyze Rome's record-keeping took place, and rather than erase it or explain it, they simply omitted it from memory. Only the tabularius and his clerks seem to have kept track of what transpired. And that's the year GPF's handwriting appears most often. He was there when no one else wanted to be. Marble can be. Quiet marble doesn't whisper. But it also doesn't lie. Among the ledges found beneath the temple were 14 tablets with a unique layout. 3 columns instead of 2. Latin inscriptions, but no personal names, no li numbers, districts, and tallies. At first, they seemed meaningless, but when one historian began to cross-reference them with known events, a pattern emerged. Each column corresponded to tax concessions granted without decree, food distributions outside the unknown system, imports from provinces during times of grain shortage. In short, crisis management, done without vote, done without fanfare, done quietly. Ferendis, or someone under his supervision, had created a system for tracking these shadow actions. Rome never officially acknowledged them, but they kept the republic stable, and they were so boring. No speeches, no battles, it's just food arriving where it needed to. Silent logistics, managed by a man no one thanked. The dull heroism of paperwork. We often think of history as the story of bold decisions, grand gestures, and visible change. But sometimes it's just continuing, keeping the carts moving, making sure someone in a village 2 days' walk from Ostia doesn't starve because someone in the Senate is busy arguing about land reforms. Ferendis didn't win wars. He made sure grain shipments were accurately invoiced. He didn't negotiate peace treaties. He documented unpaid provincial obligations without causing a panic. His gift was not charisma. It was precision. And when Rome wobbled, when civil unrest flared in Sicily, when veterans protested in the Forum, when temples ran out of ceremonial oil, he quietly rebalanced the numbers, adjusted the ledgers, wrote it all down, and then tucked the record somewhere no one would find it, unless they were really looking. The epilogue that never came. There's no record of how Ferendis died, no mention of honors, statues, or banquets, but at the end of one incomplete tablet, written in cramped, aging script, a final line stands out. The debts are neither owed nor forgiven, only remembered. It's not a line a Roman official would normally write. Romans believed in record keeping, yes, but they also believed in finality, in resolutions. This sounds more like a sigh, a man who spent a lifetime recording contradictions, keeping systems together that were always trying to fall apart. And perhaps, in his way, Ferrandus was trying to ensure Rome remembered just enough to survive itself. A room beneath the temple. If you visit the Capitoline Hill today, you won't find a plaque for Ferrandus. You'll see grand views, tourists, broken columns, but beneath the surface, literally beneath the temple of Saturn, behind crumbling walls and downlocked corridors, some of his ledgers still sit. Most are illegible. Some are unreadable. A few have been translated, and they tell the story of a city that endured not through victory, but through management, through bureaucracy, through a clerk who refused to forget the things everyone else was eager to erase. He didn't build Rome. He didn't save Rome. He preserved Rome, one quiet line at a time. And tonight, as you drift further into sleep, you might wonder how many other cities were saved not by heroes, but by record keepers, not with speeches, but with silence. Silence. If you were a Roman citizen in the spring of 149 BCE, you wouldn't have known anything was different. The market at the Forum still opened at dawn. Smell of fish and crushed olives still clung to the stone porticos, and old women still gossiped about whose son had made preter and whose cousin had been called to Africa. Priests still made sacrifices at the temple of Vesta. Senators still argued about Carthage. And yet, something had changed in the official archives of Rome. There is a small but significant blank space. A year with no consuls, no edicts, no wars declared, no votes passed, no feasts recorded. The calendar simply jumps. One year ends, the next begins. And in between nothing. At least, that's what the surface shows. But beneath the temple of Saturn, under layers of dust and disregard, the marble records of Gaius Publius Ferrandus quietly tell another story. The temple's shadow office, the Aerarium Saturni, or the treasury of Saturn, was far more than a storehouse for Rome's money. It was the administrative brain of a growing empire. 2 contracts, census rolls, and military pay scrolls. The public saw only its great bronze doors and marble steps. But below, past the storage vaults, behind a passage once sealed with wax and rope, was Ferrandus' true domain. A narrow hall, barely shouldered width, held a crude desk carved into the wall itself. Candles had been mounted into melted recesses on the stone. The air was heavy with chalk dust and drying ink. This was the subtabularium, secondary archive, where sensitive records were kept, not censored, not altered, just made quietly, inaccessible. Here Ferrandus worked, and in this quiet alcove we find the first clue about the year that didn't exist, the fiscal ghosta. Marble ledgers from that missing year do not read like normal records. There are no consul names, just numbers. There are fewer annotations, and many entries end with a single Greek letter, 5 each, at the side. Even though Latin was the official script, this symbol does not appear in any other Roman record, not in earlier or later years, not in the known epigraphy of that era. Its meaning is unknown. Some speculate it stood for phasma, the Latin word for ghost. Others believe it denoted phobos, sphere. But more likely, it was just Ferrandus' way of flagging what should not be read aloud. A quiet code for a quiet year. One example, dated to interregnum, I in red ink. 678 Modia grain, rerouted from Apulia to Tarentum. Distribution unauthorized. Phi. Another. Veterans of Hispania unrested. Land grants delayed. Taint. Issued regardless. Phi. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds. Someone had kept Rome running during this lost year. Ferrandus had balanced the empire's books, while the Republic looked the other way. Why hide a year? Historians still debate what happened in this vanished time. There are no signs of foreign war, no plagues recorded, no massive fires. But one theory stands out. At the time, Rome was preparing for a third and final war against Carthage. The Senate was divided. The public was anxious. Resources were being siphoned quietly from other regions in preparation. Or promised land that didn't exist yet. Tax levies were increased without vote. In short, Rome was committing to a war it couldn't afford, politically or financially. And Ferrandus, down in his silent marble corridor, was the one doing the math. He might have realized something dangerous. That Rome's expenditures could not be reconciled with its promises. That debt was being hidden. That land reforms were a shell game. And perhaps, just perhaps, that realization was so dangerous that the record of it had to be removed entirely from history. So a year disappeared, but not for him. He wrote it down anyway, quietly, carefully, without permission, because someone, someday, might need to know. The clerk in the stone knits, easy to romanticize figures like Ferrandus, to picture him as a rogue archivist or secret guardian of Rome's conscience. But he wasn't. He was a clerk. He wore rough wool, ate dried beans and barley. He lived above a bakery on the edge of the Aventine Hill. His neighbors never mentioned him in their inscriptions. His name does not appear in a single senatorial decree. His job was simply to reconcile Rome's paperwork, and yet, in doing so, he preserved something no one else dared to acknowledge. It was Ferrandus who ensured that when 1,000 bushels of grain went missing, there was a note. It was Ferrandus who adjusted the payment logs to ensure soldiers weren't left unpaid, even if the records above said there was no war. And it was Ferrandus who carved 3 tiny lines of code into a piece of limestone and sealed it behind a waxed panel, so that future record keepers might one day find the truth. The discovery no one expected in 1893, when a team of German archaeologists was clearing debris from beneath the Temple of Saturn. They came across a false wall no more than a hand's width thick. Behind it, we found shelves of marble tablets, coated in soot. Most were crumbling. A few were intact, and in a far corner, wrapped in what had once been waxed cloth, they found a strange object, a small slate covered in calculations. It was a budget, not for a city, not for a province, but for silence, itemized, annotated, and, shockingly clear, its projected shortfall from absent taxation interregnum, 4,800 denarii. Projected costs for appeasement of veterans, 1,900 denarii. Overage from delayed temple renovations, 3,600 denarii. Balance achievable, 700 denarii. Avoid public notice. It was a plan. A contingency budget for a political year that could not be allowed to exist. It had been signed GPF. A quiet collapse. What happened to Ferrandus? We don't know. He vanishes from the record immediately after this fiscal ghost year. No trace of his name, no mention in Senate proceedings, no tombstone, no honorary inscription. Some believe he was dismissed. Others think he died quietly of illness. A few believe his disappearance was no accident, but his ledgers remained too dull to destroy, too boring to remember, to erase. And so they sat for nearly 2,000 years, until someone, not a historian, but a financial archivist visiting the dig site, noticed a pattern in the numbers, noticed the missing consul names, noticed the strange phi symbol dot, and realized that someone long ago had left behind a breadcrumb trail, not for fame, not for glory, but simply to keep the truth from vanishing. Debt, truth, and memory. We often think of history as a sequence of events, kings, wars, reforms, betrayals, but sometimes history is preserved in silence, in footnotes, in budget gaps, in someone keeping a ledger that they knew would never be read, just in case. Ferrandis was not a visionary. He was not brave. He was not a rebel. He was a man doing his job. A job that required dull patience, that required care, that required a tolerance for contradiction. And that is sometimes what holds a civilization together. Not ambition, not ideology, but record-keeping numbers. Because when empires fall and names fade and statues crumble, it is the balance sheet that endures. And as the last candle burns low in that quiet corridor beneath Saturn's temple, as dust settles on, forgotten marble and echo returns to silence, we are left with a simple question. What other years have we forgotten? Not by accident, but because someone needed them to vanish. If you return once more to that corridor beneath the temple of Saturn, beneath the grandeur of Rome's most sacred financial building, you'll find it now, bare. The fragments, once housed in its hidden vaults, have long since been transferred to climate-controlled shelves in European archives, where visitors pass them without pause, thinking them just more Roman debris. The temple's upper tiers have been reconstructed for tourists, and the space where Ferrandis once etched his numbers into stone has been paved over. And yet, Kate, in this final reflection, we aren't really trying to find the man anymore. Kate, been absorbed into the dull cloth of forgotten civil servants. What we're really after is the principle. It's a curious choice to record what shouldn't have been recorded. The quiet defiance of a pen pushing against imperial silence. And it brings us to a singular detail often overlooked about the ledgers themselves. They survived a fire, a very particular fire, a fire Rome never acknowledged, the fire that never happened in the autumn of 147 BCE. 2 years after the ghost Uran undocumented blaze scorched the western quarter of the Temple of Saturn. You won't find it in Livy's fragments. You won't see it in Cicero's letters. It isn't carved into any triumphal column or commemorative altar. And yet, archaeologists found definitive signs, charred foundation stones, blackened carbon traces in the ventilation shafts, and the faintest heat distortion in the plaster of the southern cellar. More than half the known tabuli stone tablets from the Aurarium Saturni show signs of abrupt heat exposure, ink charred, corners melted smooth. Papyrus scrolls stored in bronze tubes show shrinking patterns consistent with exposure to temperatures of over 200 degrees Celsius. But this is what puzzled even the most skeptical excavators. The records from the ghost year were spared. All the documents that bore Ferrandis' 5 symbols were found intact, preserved in waxed linen, tucked into a dry storage alcove below the main corridor, almost as if someone had moved them before the fire. Why? Why protect the records of a year that officially didn't exist? The last entry among the ledgers, there's one slate that doesn't follow the rest. It's shorter, cruder. The handwriting is more rushed, as if written by candlelight with fingers stiff from cold. It isn't a financial record. It's a reflection, a kind of journal entry. Just a few lines, written in Latin, translated roughly to, "No man can see a ledger without seeing himself." The state is not marble. It is numbers. And numbers do not lie. But men do. Men forget? I will not. It is signed with the same phi symbol. No initials, K, no name. Scholars debate whether it was Ferrandis himself who wrote it. Perhaps a successor. Perhaps someone else entirely. But regardless of the author, the sentiment is striking. Not dramatic, not noble. Just resolved. A clerk's promise to reality. Even if Rome forgot. Even if the Senate erased. Even if every stone bearing the year's name was chiseled, smooth, again the numbers would remember. And in this way, the ghost year was never fully lost. The invisible. Histories of bureaucracy. There is a tendency to associate history with action. Conquest, construction, destruction, rebellion. But the vast majority of Roman history, like most human history, was administration, filing, tallying, reconciling the dull repetitions that made society possible. The work done by people with no statues, no epics, no laurels. People like Gaius Publius Ferrandus. He worked alone, ate alone, and very likely died alone. But because of him, we know that a year went missing. And more than that, we know why it did. Because the ledgers show a clear pattern. Months with double grain payments, but no recorded crop failures. Military stipends rerouted through civilian construction accounts. Sudden withdrawals from temple funds, followed by ghost reimbursements. This was not chaos. This was order in the guise of absence. Rome had not fallen asleep. It had gone silent by design. An empire choosing to forget itself for a year, and one man refused to let it. The modern debate, when the charred remains of Ferrandus ledgers were cataloged in the late 20th century. Most historians dismissed them as clerical anomalies. But in the early 2000s, a small group of fiscal archaeologists, CS, that's a real discipline, began connecting his entries to wider economic patterns in the ancient world. Grain shortages in Egypt, mysterious accounting gaps in Hispania, delayed temple projects in Sicily, all aligned, they found, with Rome's so-called missing year. It suggested not only that the year existed, but that it was a coordinated economic pause, a deliberate stalling of the empire's official functions, designed to stabilize internal disorder without declaring crisis. In modern terms, you might call it a soft fiscal reset. In political terms, you might call it a covered dash up. And in the personal terms of Ferrandus, it was simply a moment that had to be recorded, not publicly, not heroically, but truthfully, because even history's invisible years deserve their footnotes. The ledger. Room today. You visit the Capitoline museums in Rome today. You might find a small display case tucked away in the third floor's epigraphy hall. It houses a dozen stone tablets, no sculptures, no color, just faded arithmetic. At first glance, most visitors walk past. There are no crowds, tour guides, just the quiet hum of air conditioning and the shuffle of shoes on marble tile. But if you stop, and if you read, you'll see something strange. Consular dates replaced with numeric codes, scribbled annotations next to otherwise clean ledgers, and, on a few pieces, the unmistakable presence of the phi symbol. There is no official plaque explaining it, but beside the case is a printout of a translated fragment. It reads, "Numbers endure where memory fades." This is not the record Rome wanted. It is the record Rome had, okay? And in that moment, the past feels oddly honest, not grand, not tragic, just persistent. Reflection beneath the steps. The story of Ferrandus does not end in revelation. There is no grand conspiracy, no secret treasure, no vanished bloodline or forbidden truth. There is only this. A quiet man noticed the empire he served had quietly disappeared for a while, and instead of asking permission, he kept writing, because that's what clerks do. They write, even when no one asks them to, even when no one wants them to. And sometimes, the ledgers they leave behind survive longer than the laws they were meant to enforce, longer than the stones they were meant to support, longer than the cities they were meant to fund. In. So tonight, as we drift through the dull corridors of forgotten Roman finance, let this thought linger gently. How many truths are hiding in numbers? How many truths were never erased because someone wrote them down, not for glory, but for accuracy? And what secrets might still be resting beneath the foundations of the systems we think we understand?